My name's Frank Doyle. I'm an ecosystems biologist. I've worked on many different species within our boreal forest ecosystems and in the tundra for the best part of 40 years. And some 30 years ago now, I was working in the Yukon on a large ecosystem project up in the Yukon, and I kept getting these phone calls from, and I happened to be working on birds of prey in the Yukon. I was working on many different species, and one of the birds was called a goshawk. And at that time I was getting phone calls from the Skeena region, because I was a goshawk specialist, asking me about goshawks and asking me about managing goshawks and trapping goshawks and how much habitat do they need. What had happened was they just had found two nests. They were logging, and the big machines in there, and the loggers were in there, and the machines were being dive bombed by these large birds, these big grey hawks, which are the size of ravens. And the guys, the equipment, could see these birds swooping down. They knew they were near a nest site, and they didn't want to have the nest fail. So they basically called the Ministry of Environment and said, how much forest do we need to leave for these goshawks? So that's why I was getting phone calls, was around that. And eventually, these phone calls led to longer discussions, and then I was invited down here with the idea that maybe I could help understand what the goshawks need and how do we manage the forest, how can we keep enough forest so we can keep those birds, because the loggers, the people all wanted to keep the birds in the landscape. And I thought, yeah, that's a great use of my time. So that's why I came down here, Dan, was to do that work. And so we're at Date Creek today. So we knew of two nest sites at that time that, because it reported to us by the people who were out logging in industry. And so when we started looking for birds ourselves, this was one of the very first birds we found, was in this landscape. This is the Date. We're in the Date landscape, and we've got the Date Creek Research Forest just over the hill. There's the Sunday Lake Forest Service Road behind us, and this is a beautiful, intact, old-growth hemlock forest. And so we were surveying for goshawks, looking for goshawks in this landscape, and this is one of the first places we found birds. And I came out here, stood right here down with a forester called Norm Bilodeau, and we have a goshawk nest behind us that I'm looking up right now that is still there and has been in that tree for the best part of 20, 30 years. The nest is still there, even though the birds have been long gone for a long time now. And we found several of the nest sites, and the discussion was around how do we harvest this landscape? How do we keep the birds here in this landscape? And so that was the very first time I came here, was to stand here and have the same discussion, if you like, as we're having right now about what do we do if we want to keep these birds in the landscape. Well, the goshawks are at that point right now, and again, just representative of many of the species that we're not monitoring out there. The fisher and the martin would be ones people would recognize. And if we manage for the goshawks, we have areas left in the landscape. But remember that population story, you have to have enough individuals. So right now we're at the stage, right now, where we have enough places left in the landscape that will support individual goshawk territories. And they need big areas. They need 4,000, 6,000 hectares of relatively intact landscape. And we have just about enough of those out there right now. If we want to manage those differently, manage those areas differently, take wood out, but not clear-cut harvest, we can keep that goshawk population. In areas where we've clear-cut harvest, in other areas where we still have old-growth forest and that the birds can use, then we can let the young forest grow back. Eventually, in 100 years' time, it'll also support the goshawk territories. And that's the work we're looking at on Haida Gwaii in many areas now, is where do we want the birds to be in the future? But we've got to make those conscious changes right now. We've got to actually start doing things that actually will create habitat. So one of the key lessons here, maybe optimism, but I really need to say this clearly, is that old-growth forest is not a renewable resource. That we cannot, when we harvest an old forest, we call it old growth, or it may just be old forest, it may just be a 100-year-old forest, but it has structure. It has snags, it has coarse woody debris, it has places for the birds and the bats and all those things. When we remove those and clear-cut harvest, all we have are individual trees. We don't have structure, so we'll never have any of those other pieces, and you can't restore it. You can't plant snags. You can't pile up logs across the landscape with fire risk, all these other reasons. So this is not a renewable resource. You can harvest this forest and plant trees, but it is not a forest. With climate change, the idea that in 30 years' time we're going to stand here and have a conversation about what are our options is ludicrous. We've got to stop right now, change what we do right now, and then maybe we've got a chance. but not in 30 years' time. And I've been doing this 30 years, so I can say that. Because 30 years ago, Billado and I thought we could really do some stuff here. We were excited to make some changes. But because of the structure of government and the way our system is at that larger scale, again, not necessarily local, we can't do that, but we need some big changes.